COVID-19 has reshaped globalization and further strained Sino-American relations. How will this influence China's role in the Middle East and the wider Mediterranean region? The ChinaMed Tel Aviv University China in the Mid-Med series looks at this dynamic in conversation with leading global voices. Look at the world of tomorrow. Join the China in the Mid-Med series.
Welcome to the ChinaMed and Tel Aviv University China in the Mid-Med series, a series of conversations looking at how the current global dynamics are affecting China's role in the Middle East and the wider Mediterranean region. My name is Brandon Friedman. I'm the Director of Research at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. My co-hosts for this event today are Professor Sela, the Chair of the Department of East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and Professor Enrico Fardella, the Director of the Center for Mediterranean Area Studies at Peking University, and the Director of the ChinaMed project. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce our guest this evening, Edward Luttwak. I will not be able to do justice to Edward's long list of publications or to his incredible life story and practical experience. Instead, I'll give you a brief introduction and let his wealth of knowledge and experience speak for itself. Edward Luttwak is the author of The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy and Strategy, the Logic of War and Peace, both published by Harvard University Press. He's also the author of the classic Coup d'etat, a Practical Handbook, as well as a book on the Israeli army with Daniel Horowitz, as well as many other remarkable books and articles. Edward serves as a consulting contractor to the U.S. Department of Defense. He has served on U.S. presidential transition teams, and he has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate as an expert. We warmly welcome you, Edward. Thank you for making the time to speak with us this evening.
Very happy to.
Enrico, would you like to start us off, please?
Yes, sure. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Edward, for being with us. Thank you, Brandon, for your introduction. As always, I would like to begin from the past. Edward, experience with China has a very long history. Actually, you happen to be in Beijing, next to in Mao's memorial, next to the Gang of Four, in a picture taken on September 1976. That was a very important trip, I must say. Can you tell us something about it?
Well, in 1976, there was a U.S. Secretary of Defense, James R. Schlesinger, who he was thrown out of his job by President Ford because he believed that the United States should support China against Russia vigorously, whereas Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, was very keen to maintain his relationship with Moscow. Schlesinger was more inclined to help the Chinese. So a delegation was made of different people. And strangely enough, in 1976, my identity for the US Department of Defense was as an expert on armored warfare, because I had, of course, I was a participant, a volunteer participant in the 1967 war in a minor infantry capacity. In the 1973 war, I was there as an observer and actually saw the tank battles of the Chinese farms, so-called, etc. I witnessed those tank battles. I was a student of war, and I therefore wrote a study on armored warfare. At that moment, the 45 Soviet divisions, tank divisions, mechanized divisions, were deployed, focused on Beijing. And there was extreme political tension, but there was also an actual military threat. At least it looked like a threat on the map, a military threat. Therefore, the delegation included me. I was the number 2 as the tank expert, tank armored warfare expert. And in fact, as a result of that trip, by the way, was initiated the very first arms purchase that the People's Republic of China made from Israel, many years before there were any kind of official relations. So I subsequently, for the last 40 plus years, I've been a beneficiary of this gift I brought to them, because they keep, every time, as you know, Enrico, every time I go to Beijing, the military come out, they invite me, they insist on paying for all my expenses and do all these wonderful things. So I was an accidental visit. I was an accidental armor expert, because really I was just there to see the fighting, and I crossed the canal and all that. But I was, it's true, I was really interested in armor warfare. I was the US Army Training and Doctrine Command expert, as it were. So then in China, I could have been a serious person like you, Enrico, and others in this program, and studied Chinese, because I was really very interested. But instead, I got distracted in other things, including raising cattle in Bolivia, in the Amazon, and some. So I never studied Chinese, but every year, for one reason or another, I visited China. And in China, I have a core group of friends who are more or less in my line of business. They are, in different ways, advisors of the Chinese government. And I think you know some of them, like Liu Zhang and son, whose importance and access has varied over the years. Although the most important of them is still alive, Jiang Bijan was big enough that when Xi Jinping acceded to his current autocratic interpretation of being number 1, he was the one who wrote the letter, the article in People's Daily announcing Xi Jinping's Secretary Generalship and so on. So he is still, and he's a close personal friend of mine, whom I first met back in 1976, when he was afraid that his mom was going to starve because he was going to get arrested. As you know, he was connected to Deng Xiaoping. So I helped him out because that time there was a Jew in the Yugoslavian embassy in Beijing, and I made an arrangement that he dropped off a sack of rice once a month, big sack of rice, in front of this old lady's door, who lived in a hutung in Beijing, in one of these courtyards. So she was a very popular member of that courtyard because she had rice. And the Yugoslav didn't spare himself. He didn't drop a 10-kilo kind of thing, more like industrial grade. So long history and never serious. I never sat down either to learn Chinese or to study the literature, on the sinological literature, just read casually here and there. But I did do a lot of travel. I visited Xinjiang and Tibet and Mongolia and all kinds of places. In fact, with my wife, I have a very, very old wife. I'm looking for a new one, but with her, we traveled in Yunnan and did a wonderful trip from the warm tropical, the Vietnamese border, all the way into Tibet. And when I didn't get a permit either, because my friends in Beijing took care of that kind of stuff. So I didn't have to request permission from the Tibetan autonomous, regional government, whatever, make you wait 2 weeks and all that nonsense and stuff. So my knowledge of China is completely superficial. It is like a tourist who's been there many, many times, but never went deeper. So the book I wrote about China is not, in fact, based on any kind of sinological pretensions. What I write there is that I know nothing about China. Everything I write is I'm observing their external behavior, how they act outside. Nothing about internal motivations. And the only sinological thing in the entire book is about the famous mountain bank and charlatan Shunze, and the fact that the Chinese actually believe that Shunze offers anything resembling strategic analysis. You know, from the point of view of Clausewitz, Shunze is a mountebank, a charlatan, a trickster. And the Chinese still think that it's strategy. And one of the sub-results of that, one of the consequences, is that the Chinese always think that they can solve strategic problems with tricks. And I'll end with that, because Chinese history is a long history of 3 people showing up on horseback and 2 Chinese generals in front of vast Chinese armies exchanging elegant quotations of Shunze. You know, Shunze said this, Shunze said that. Meantime, the 3 guys on horseback enter, conquer China, and rule it for 200-300 years as they wish. So that's the only Chinese thing I write, and it's not about China as a political phenomenon, but a very narrow cultural analysis of this, what you might call misprision of evidence. In other words, mistaking the fact that when you have 4 Chinese states with the same customs, the same rules, and interacting, Wu and so on, the 4 Chinese warring states, or 5, whatever they were, and within the same cultural frame, they could do the kind of strategy that resembles Italian politics, where people pretend to be enemies, then they suddenly form a coalition government with their ex-enemies, and then they cross the street and they share the same mistresses and so on. That is what Shunze was writing about. Clever tricks intraculturally between people who are playing a game that does involve some fighting here and there, but it's actually not war, because the essence of war is no rules. Whereas there are many rules when you fight, when you have this kind of endo-cultural disputes. And from that, you have Shunze, and from that, you have the fact that the poor Chinese, nice people as they are, go in a cruel world armed with the wrong method of dealing with the outside world. And we have seen evidence of that just in the last 3 weeks.
Edward, if I may, I mean, this is fascinating. I mean, I would say from a sinological point of view, by the way, Sunze was never Sunze in China. I mean, he became Sunze only mostly in the 20th century and later. And then you can see all kinds of foreign dignitaries quoting him as if there's anything to it, making a lot of the Chinese raise their brows and trying to understand what are you saying and why. But
he was marketed very well. Napoleon was talked about him.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's a battle trick.
I have 2 quick questions that I have to follow up on the beginning of what you were telling us about 1976, because, you know, often in Israel, when we are talking about the, you know, the beginning of the arms deals between Israel and China and the PRC in the late 1970s, what we often hear is about the war in Vietnam and China's need to upgrade its tanks. Was it the T-59, I think?
T-59.
And I think there's a missing link here that you're providing here that set the stage already in 1976 for the later endeavors by Sol Eisenberg and others that
right. Eisenberg never paid me royalties. When the Chinese took me on the border, they showed me their pathetic anti-tank deployment. I said that many Russians would die if they arrived there from laughter at this incredibly stupid arrangement they had, because they had forward-facing, forward slope. You understand? Forward weapons, so the Russians would accept. When that happened, I explained to them the following, that there was the British LI-7 105 millimeter gun, which was a good gun. More to the point, it had very good ammunition, far superior to the Soviet 100 millimeter equivalent ammunition. Secondly, I said that the Israelis are making it under license, and more to the point, that the Israelis had adopted the gun to be inserted in the turret of the T-55. And the T-55 turret, which they inserted in, was the B, T-55 Beta. And that the Chinese T-59, which they were kind enough to show me, I realized that the T-59 is not, in fact, as some of the books wrote, a Chinese version of the T-54, but in fact, it was a Chinese version of the T-55, which meant that the Israeli gun could be bought. If you bought it from the British, you would have to have a long period of adaptation. You bought it from the Jews, they would fit right in. And so the Chinese started investigating, and we're talking September 1976, we're talking Gang of Four. At that moment, the best tanks of the Chinese army were in fact in the Shanghai military region, because Wang Hongwen was planning something, for which you need tanks. I presume it is a coup d'etat. So, in that moment, what happened was that they got the information, they couldn't act on it. But but that was what got the Chinese army to do it. That is how it happened.
Right.
Thank
you.
Information. And the payoff was that if you, of course, you go to the 105, you have good quality ammunition.
Right.
Because there was already the armor-piercing discarding sabot, called in English, which is the arrow round. A small caliber round, right. All the energy of 105 concentrated on the narrow penetration. That was the whole story.
Thank you.
I got many dinner profits from it, but Eisenberg did not pay me a commission.
Enrico?
Yeah, Brandon, you want to say something?
No, go ahead, please, Enrico.
No, I mean, because that's fascinating as always, Edward. So I would say, since then, I mean, a long time has gone by, and the day you came up with this book, it became like a bestseller, especially in Japan, where Edward is a star. And in your book, you are highlighting a dilemma between like economic and military growth of China. Now, can you illustrate a bit the mechanism of this dilemma and whether you see this happening today?
Well, apart from that small excursion into Shunze and the circumstances, the entire book is a entirely mechanical, deterministic exercise in which I proclaimed axiomatically, dogmatically, that strategy is stronger than politics. And that what would happen is that as the Chinese rise economically, because of course, when I was doing the research, 2008, 2009, the Chinese were fully moving, of course, and had accumulated already a lot, would get much more. I said that the Chinese would be unable to prevent themselves from expanding and pushing the weight around and provoke reactions from their neighbors. And the reactions will lead to an anti-China coalition that would surround China on the maritime side, and that this would then result in a horrible downfall, which could be avoided by purchasing copies of an excellent Chinese language book called The Fall of Wilhelmine Germany. Wilhelmine Germany by 1914 had the world's best bank, the world's biggest and most modern bank, Deutsche Bank. It had the most advanced steel industry, electronics industry, electrical industry, pharmaceuticals, and so on, and the best universities, and more or less a monopoly of high scholarship. If you went to Oxford University in 1914, the only subject you could study without first taking German exam was English literature. Because if you studied any science, you needed German. If you studied Latin or Greek, that was the German intellectual achievement. Altertumswissenschaft. You couldn't think of studying any Roman or Greek subject if you didn't know German. So they had academically the top, financially the top, industrially the top, but they felt the need to acquire little islands in the Pacific and so on, and for which they would need to build a fleet. That was once a land power like Germany builds a fleet, it's all over. It's only a question of what kind of timing and what kind of music you want to put to it, whether it's Wagner, Mahler, and so on. And therefore, I deprived the Chinese government of agency, as they say in the modern language. I said they will do that, and they will continue expanding and making territorial claims, even when people start reacting. Now, at that point in time, a real sinologist, Mike Pillsbury, went to the director of net assessment, Andrew Marshall, and said, do not distribute Edwards' study, because Edwards' study says the US should do nothing and allow the Australians, Japanese, Indians to fall into place to his strategic model and make a coalition against China. Andy Marshall ignored him. My study was distributed. Subsequently, it became a book. But as I say, mechanistic. And at that time, one of the things that was pointed out to me was that the Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan, was a neutralist. And more important, the person who made him Prime Minister, Ozawa, was a real neutralist and anti-American. I've had dinners with Ozawa. He's a very nice guy, but he really does hate America. And I said that was irrelevant because strategy is stronger than politics. And I didn't know it was going to be Abe Shinzo or some other guy. Somebody would come in Tokyo and kick back at the Chinese. At the time, the Prime Minister of India, who I had the honor of knowing, was Singh, a wonderful man who believed that economics was the beginning and end of all life, and who said that if the Chinese cross into useless, cold terrain in Ladakh is no concern of his. And I said, that's also irrelevant because sooner or later, Delhi government would start reposing it. Of course, the Vietnamese were already there. And when I was finishing my book, the Australian government, then headed by a prime minister, universally described as ridiculously pro-Chinese, issued a white paper in which they said, if we don't start organizing against China, even New Zealand will be a Chinese colony. So in other words, I was not at all sinological or even serious about analyzing the politics. I noted the politics and I said it's irrelevant because the logic of strategy dominates. So this is the kind of deterministic, mechanistic thinking that Leninists have always been blamed for and so on, but that's what I do in the book. That's what you read in the book.
So do you see, do you see the so-called pivot to Asia right around
absolutely.
that? Do you see that as a failure or something that builds into your description?
No. When I finished the book, when I revised the book for publication by Harvard, it was originally a Defense Department report. It was just a report. The pivot had already been announced. And the pivot was a kind of a beginning, recognition. At that point, the United States was still focused on nation building in Afghanistan. If you turn Afghanistan into Sweden, they'll behave like Swedes, But Hillary Clinton, who was an excellent Secretary of State, carved out this little sphere and she launched the Southern Mekong Initiative. The point about the Mekong River, which I'm sure all of you have seen, and it's a beautiful river, is that it starts in China. And if you drive on that road from Yunnan to Tibet, at a certain point, you're driving over the beginning of the Mekong. But her initiative wasn't the Mekong River Initiative. It was the Lower Mekong Initiative in trying to get some action. As you know, that is the one place in that segment the Chinese have an ally, which is Cambodia. Because in the world of Cambodians, there is only Vietnam. Vietnam is wrapped over them. The Vietnamese are on top of them, below them, sideways, and terrified of Vietnam. Therefore, they are pro-Chinese. The Laotians are right on the Chinese border, but the Laotians are basically an extension of the Thai, strategically speaking, so they know how to handle everybody, including the Chinese. So the Lower Mekong Initiative actually started bringing some real action there, and it was an American step. Hillary Clinton, to put it again in these historicist terms, which have been, Karl Popper ridiculed them, and every intelligent person rejects them. That is when she felt the logic of it, and she acted it, and she did a very nice job within a limited means. But when I wrote the book, the only country that was behaving as per the model was Vietnam, and the Vietnamese, fortunately, they took the view that China is a paper tiger, and it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons they have or how many ships they have, because they don't have it. They don't have it. That was the Vietnamese position. Now, and in the book, actually, I managed to put in the episode which proved the itness of the it, because that's when the Chinese put an offshore platform off the coast of Vietnam in order to drill for oil. And the Vietnamese believed it was their water, so they sent their puny, pathetic little boats around the big Chinese platform. Then the Chinese sent big boats. Then the Vietnamese said, by the way, this is not a game. This is not chess. So they gave a green light or a yellow light to go and attack any Chinese in Vietnam. Tourists, businessmen, investors, some Taiwanese, Singaporeans got it clobbered. And the message was, we will cross the border into Yunnan province, where, by the way, as you know, a high percentage of the population is not Han, but minority. And for some reason, they don't really love the Han at all. And we will cross the border and attack you. So what did the Chinese do? They're sensible. They withdrew the platform. They thought it was chess, you see. They thought, typically, because of this mentality, Shunzi and all that the Vietnamese would send little boats, then they send big boats, and then the Vietnamese will withdraw. You see, that is typical thinking of people who don't understand the logical strategy. Instead, they had to withdraw. By the way, I'm happy to say that the Vietnamese then chartered an honest boat of Texans, Bible readers all, just like the noble energy people who found gas in the Mediterranean. And the Bible readers were there, and they immediately found oil off the coast of Vietnam. So there it goes. That's the difference between serious people and people who think that it's all about moving things. But incidentally, what happened in the last 10 days or 15 days would prove any such case about strategic imbecility, because in the same period of about a week, they sank a Vietnamese fishing boat, crossed the border into Ladakh, stopped beef imports with Australia because the Australians were pushing for the WHO investigation, and threatened Sweden with invasion, I suppose, because the Swedes closed all their, all their Confucius institutes, all the Hamban, every Chinese entity, cultural entity in Sweden, happened within 7 days or 8 days. So, if there's a lesson of strategy is don't quarrel with everybody at the same time. What about that? So,
well, it might also be applied to the U.S. in the last few months, I must say.
Well, the United States hasn't started quarrels with anybody except China, of course. I mean, there's nobody else, but the China thing, of course, is very belated.
Edward.
Can I ask you people about Israel's position here? Because, one of my friends in Israel, with whom I had the pleasure of sharing a truly wonderful raid in Lebanon, It was the fellow who ended up being chairman of the Israel aircraft industry, who had to write a check for $250 million to the Chinese upon the cancellation of the airborne radar. I'm talking about Janusz Bengal. Janusz Bengal becomes the head of Tassia Aviv, Israel aircraft industry, and the first thing he had to do was to write a check for more money than he thought existed in the world. That's how it ended up with Falcon program. Given this background, nobody in the Pentagon trusts Israel at all in regard to safeguarding technology from the Chinese. You know, and the Pentagon people believe that the Jews and the Chinese have a subterranean relationship of their own.
Larry, you want to take that one?
Yes, please.
I'll have to say that I'm not sure about the subterranean relationship, but well, as you know, one of our many mistakes, our meaning the state of Israel, was that after the Falcon, we had another rerun with the Harpy drones that got the US again on its feet. And what I can say about that is that after that one, meaning around 2006, Israel managed to actually establish a platform or a mechanism to regulate all of its arms sales. I think that the main problem that we see today is very different because it's a different kind of world in a sense, because—
You're talking about Sibat?
Yes.
You're talking about the establishment of Sibat?
Yes.
Right.
Which is, I think, quite effective. The problem is different because today, if you have, for example, a foreign country that invests in a high-tech company that looks totally civilian, that high-tech company's technology can be used in many different ways. So, for example, if you have picture processing algorithms, you can easily, you know.
Right, but let me just say that the State Department mechanism that authorizes the export of technology, knowledge, you know, they have developed together with a lot of other people a certain rough and ready criteria, which has some validity to it. It doesn't have ultimate validity, of course, because one doesn't know, you know, this technology is really evolving so quickly, you don't actually know, and so on and so forth. But at least formally, they have a means of control. The reason why nobody in Washington trusts the Israelis when Israelis deal with anybody else in the world, they have no problem. When they see the Israeli National Security Advisor going to Moscow and piling up in Moscow, nobody worries. It's only the Chinese, okay? Only the Chinese. And in that story that you recounted, you missed the fact that between Falcon and Harpy, right? By the way, Harpy is the world's first robot. You understand that? The first combat robot. And I take my hat off to all the military bureaucrats all over the world who, other than the Chinese, who missed the point. Because they all talk robots, they finance robot studies. When they can actually buy a robot and use it, they don't. They don't, of course. There's no Harpy in the US system. So in between the highly publicized Falcon and the highly publicized Harpy, somebody, and it wasn't me, transferred the Lavi technology to China and got paid a mountain of gold for that and provided the Chinese with their only fighter that actually works, which is the Lavi, okay? It's a chop suey Lavi, but the difference is between the Lavi and the original Lavi.
Well, you're talking about the J10.
Sorry?
You're talking about the J10.
I'm talking about the Lavi. You can call it Mary or Saris. It's the same girl, you know.
But here it can also go backwards in time because interestingly, and again, I don't have an opinion as to whether or not the J10 is the Lavi or and so on and so forth. But if you look at photos dating back to 1987, you can already see visits by Chinese experts from the.
Right. Listen, let's not go down.
It goes
that
back
road,
in time.
okay? Let me tell you, the girl can call herself whatever she wants. But the fact is that today, as the two of us are speaking, the only aircraft in the inventory of the Chinese Air Force says that has any combat value are either the Russian ones imported from Russia, or, and only partially so, they're illegal copies of the Sukhoi 27, which they made, they stole from the Russians and so on. They paid for them retroactively, but stolen. But, and the Lavi is a functional aircraft because it's a Jewish aircraft. Let's face it, very cute, looks like a nice girl, and so on. Depending on absolutely doesn't trust. The moment they see an Israeli and a Chinese together, they know that something is going to switch hands, some penknife or something, and so on. The Chinese, by the way, are the same. The Chinese were very offended by the Falcon thing. And I said to them at the time, when I said to them, you are supporting the Palestinians, you're supporting the Arabs, you are a strategic enemy of Israel, so they shouldn't be supplying you with anything, even a penknife. And the Chinese looked at me and said to me, you don't really believe that, do you? You don't believe that. You think
Edward, can I close the circle on that point? We know that in October, the arms embargo on Iran is supposed to expire. So I suppose my question is, do you think that the Lavi will end up in Tehran? Are we going to see China engage in arms deals with Iran after the arms embargo is lifted?
Well, I think the Iranians don't have any money. And the Chinese are very sentimental people, and they give happiness to anybody in exchange for nice words plus cash, money. The people produce the Lavi in China, right? They will never give an aircraft without being paid. So if the Iranians had money, this would be a serious issue. But there is another question as well, which is that the Lavi is now, she was a beautiful girl, but she's now well after middle age. She still looks nice, and people of my age will find her attractive, but let's face it, in the F-35 world, it's a piece, it's basically a paper airplane today. So if the Israeli Air Force has one F-35, they shoot down every lone Lavi,
You're right that the Iranians are hurting for cash, but they do have quite a bit of oil.
I know, but look, the fact is, don't worry about the Lavi, okay? The Lavi is an old lady, and it's an old story. The reason I mentioned the Lavi is because of something that should concern people like us. Namely, there was a huge dispute about Falcon and a huge dispute about Harpy, and in between, the important sale was made, and nobody actually did anything about it.
Sure. So now that you've put my concern about the Lavi to rest, should we be concerned about other technology transfers in the military realm from Beijing to Tehran?
Well, let me tell you, there's no mechanism. When you sell anything to the Chinese, there's no mechanism whatsoever to prevent it from moving around within the Chinese system. You are real sinologists, unlike me. So therefore, you know in a deeper way than I could do that every Chinese institution is very businesslike, okay? This is, you're not dealing, whatever their formal designation, they're businesslike. So if there's a hot piece of technology somewhere in the system that you can sell, to Papua New Guinea, they're going to get it and sell it. A lot of the Chinese arms selling behavior cannot be really strongly connected to their foreign policy.
Thank you.
If guys selling the weapons sell the weapons, you know. They're commercial people. The Chinese are a commercial, okay? They're not Russians. You know, the rule is simple. The Chinese are good at everything except strategy. The Russians are good for nothing except strategy. That's why with the GDP of Italy, they are still really a great power. They may not be a world power, but they're definitely a great power. And part of the Chinese having no understanding of strategy is that the whoever they appoint, they can appoint some person who spent his entire life in the PLA as an infantry PLA. The moment they appoint him anywhere there is money involved, he goes right back to being a Cantonese noodle seller. And that's how we've seen them selling weapons around the world. I myself purchased Kalashnikovs from the Chinese in order for the purposes of attacking a proximate ally of the Chinese.
So,
Business.
So, okay. So, Edward, I mean, if I have to make some inference from your, for what you just said, that means that the Belt and Road Initiative, so then it's a bad strategy and good business.
Sorry, I missed that. The what? Bertolt Initiative.
The Belt and Road Initiative, so it's a bad strategy and good business.
Well, so far it has not been good business. But I put Belt and Road in a different category. I put it under the subheading called autism. As you know, all great powers are autistic. The Chinese are the greatest power, and they're more autistic. And they actually believe that if you go to foreign countries and build infrastructures, the people will be grateful to you. Well, they should have consulted the British and the French in their colonial empires who built the institutions that these countries still live on. And they, strangely enough, when you go to a foreign country and you build an institution, they're not grateful. You know, it's a tragic aspect of human life. For example, one of the wonderful places in the world is Sri Lanka, Ceylon, right? And I remember when in Ceylon, everybody was anti-Indian. And they longed for the arrival of the first Chinese so they would relieve them from the crushing, oppressive weight of India on top of them. Now, when you go to Sri Lanka, they say, oh, the Indians, well, they're basically our brothers, our neighbors. The Chinese, no. So Belt and Road Initiative is obviously operated by the Central Intelligence Agency as a way of ruining Chinese relations with foreign countries. I mean, what happened in Malaysia, I don't have to remind you of that. The Malaysians were always anti-Chinese, frankly, but they made them much more anti-Chinese. Sri Lanka were pro-Chinese, made them anti-Chinese, and that will be the consequence. And if you go to Africa, you'll find a very mysterious lack of sympathy for the Chinese, including in Tanzania, where the Chinese came about a generation ago and built a railway, and people hate the Chinese. And the mystery of that is, of course, the perversity of human nature. Because the Indians, for example, should love the British and kiss their hands. It's true, they treat them very well when the British visit, but they don't allow them, for example, to carry a little whip under their arm, you know, a little stick, to hit them on the head when they get, you know, if a British tourist takes his little side stick and hits an Indian because he misbehaves, they probably complain about it. Lack of gratitude, considering what the British did. So Belt and Road is politically naive. As for the economic advantages of it, the only one I know personally studied and I've been there and seen it is, of course, the railway, you know, the train that goes to Dostik or Druzhba, what they call it, and then goes to Astana, and Astana proceeds to Russia and Riga, right? And that railway is a wonderful thing for Kazakhstan, but it's been the source of considerable irritation and bad blood. And the Kazakhs under Russian pressure on the heads, had a very positive attitude to the Chinese until the Belt and Road stuff. Now they don't. It's true that there was also the persecution of the Kazakhs in the Kazakh Uli autonomous prefecture in Xinjiang. But even before then, there was trouble because of it. So I think Belt and Road is politically a failure, I would say. I only mentioned a few countries, it affects many more, and perhaps in some places it works, but in principle it doesn't, as a theory, you know.
And Edward,
You know,
if I could ask you a question about Egypt, we see China gradually expanding its presence and influence around the Suez Canal zone. I wanted to know if you thought that China's interest in Egypt was more than just economic, whether there was a strategic component there, and if that's something that Israel should be concerned about.
Well, the Chinese answer to your question is, we would never act against Israel. We are Chinese, we are never going to act against the only people in the world who are like us. All the other peoples are barbarians, there's just us and the Jews. So this is an issue which they don't talk about, but it's a real factor, okay? It has significance. The other thing has to do that in Egypt, obviously, if the Egyptians are receptive to the Chinese, they can do stuff there and so on. And the Egyptians now have resources because even though gas isn't what it used to be, they now will have gas revenues because their gas they found will take a long time to develop. That's why they made a deal with Israel for the interim, but eventually it's going to be gigantic gas, should be, that they can sell in Europe, and therefore they can import a lot of stuff from the Chinese. So there's room for that. But I don't view that as a strategic threat. Again, you know, the mechanics of it don't work in that sense. I mean, you know.
Edward, if I may, I'd like us to kind of switch a little bit, and perhaps you can help us understand the American strategy within this story. From our neck of the woods, it seems that the US often pulls a little bit away, let's say, from the Middle East. It seems that China is much more present. It seems that Russia is for sure more present. And that the US, not only in this area, but in general, seems to be kind of shying away from international organizations and so on and so forth. So I wonder if you can kind of let us into the American strategy in that regard, and how the US sees all of these involvement in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean, as we just said about Italy.
Well, before Trump, independently of Trump, the United States was disengaging from the Middle East. Literally, militarily disengaging from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and so on, held back by, held back by really irrelevant people who had irrelevant concerns and false hopes and so on. Nation building failed. The point about these involvements in the Muslim world is not that they're expensive, which they are very expensive, or difficult, or involve casualties, but they're completely futile. It's futile. It's not hard to do strategy in the Middle East. It's simply useless because nothing, whatever you do falls apart. It doesn't matter, So the Americans took them a hell of a long time to learn that, but now they have. So that chapter is a closed chapter. They're not going to re-engage. Secondly, with the Russians, Donald Trump may not be Clausewitz, but Donald Trump understands that if the Americans drop the ball, if the Americans fail, and the Russians find themselves entering a Chinese-dominated world, the Russians will be America's allies. That's why the Democrats efficiently prevented them from ever articulating this geopolitical position he had on Russia, but he did. He said during the election campaign, says you can't do China and Russia at the same time. Nixon went with the Chinese against the Russians. I propose to go with Putin against the Chinese. And I know Putin is not a perfect guy. When Nixon embraced Mao Zedong was not in the habit of brushing his teeth, so he must have been quite stinky, but he embraced him nonetheless. And I want to embrace Putin no matter what. That was the Trump position. The Democratic Party and the media and some managed to never actually write down the geopolitical position that Trump had. But he himself called it Geopolitics 101. Therefore, China is everything. Now, the difference between Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi is that Donald Trump wants to go there pushing, counter-pushing, supporting Hong Kong, Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi is axiomatic. She says the regime, the Communist Party regime, has to be completely destroyed in order for the peoples that are within its purview to be able to live properly, whether it's Tibetans, Uyghur, and of course, Han people, not to speak of Mongols and 50 other people. So Nancy Pelosi's position is categorical. That regime must disappear. Trump just wanted to contain them and fight them, and it took him it's only maybe in the last 6 months that he realizes that Nancy is the way ahead. Now Trump is like Ronald Reagan was in February 1st, 1981, which is the Soviet Union must be destroyed. Then we will deal with the remaining problems. And Trump is now moved closer to the Nancy Pelosi position. Charles Schumer is simply takes anti-Chinese attitudes because he reflects public opinion, personal, individual, institutional, all over the United States. So the Americans as a collectivity are all, quote, anti-China, and their interpretation of China is to be not anti-Chinese, of course, and to be as open as possible to individual Chinese, wherever they are, in China, Hong Kong, whatever, but against the regime. And it is a normal thing, very normal in American terms, that this consensus is also the only consensus. That is to say, Pelosi, Schumer, and Trump do not agree on anything except the need to destroy completely the Communist Party regime of China. That's the only thing they agree on. And the fact that it's the only thing they agree on gives a certain energy, because I'm a consultant to this government, and I'm living in a kind of isolated pool of complete serenity. All the other policy people in the government are all, revolutions, turmoil, controversy. The Chinese is just calm pool there. Matt Pottinger gave an important speech at the University of Virginia Chinese Center. He gave it in Mandarin. I'm told his Mandarin is good.
May 4th. His May 4th speech.
He was commemorating the May 4th, 1919, which was the inauguration of modern political life in China. Commemorating it. So there is the Deputy National Security Advisor, China expert, making a big speech about China, zero about American complaints, American demands, American grievances. No, it's an evocation of May 4th. So this tells you just how dangerous these Americans are, because they're going to the very source of Chinese political life and saying, we have to go back to that and have this plant grow straight up, and we will applaud its growth and branches. We just have to finish with Xi Jinping and this other stuff. And Xi Jinping is collaborating, I must say, by causing damage to China every single day. Everything he does damages a Chinese student, a Chinese academic who was on his way to do a scholarship program in Copenhagen, because, by the way, when the Chinese attacked the Swedes, the Danish said, okay, we will do the same. Right? It's the kind of thing that the Chinese don't realize. They think you can sink a fishing boat, Vietnamese fishing boat, and you don't get the reaction from the Indonesians you do. And so on. So Xi Jinping every day is causing a real personal loss to a Chinese person. Whether it's a student who was going to study in America, or or Canada, or England, or Australia, you know, I guess he can still go and study in Mozambique. I mean, you know, if he wants to go. To an academic scholar, a professor, a doctor, somebody who wanted to go to University of Southern Illinois to write on Chinese medieval history, he can't go. The businessman who wanted to sell something, the investor who wanted to buy a company. You know, the Australians have what Israel, of course, now is acquiring, which is a Foreign Investment Evaluation Analysis Commission. And in regard to China, do you know what is the level at which the investment is subject to scrutiny?
$0.
$1. $1 Australian dollar. So this is all caused by Xi Jinping. And himself is in trouble because of him, because if he didn't start boasting around, the Americans wouldn't have noticed that every integrated circuit used by Huawei is manufactured with American technology by Taiwan Semiconductor, and that its core architecture is ARM Cambridge, England, which has swapped, you know, licensing agreements. So he's a very expensive guy, this Xi Jinping.
Go ahead, Enrico, please.
Yeah. So, Edward, do you think that somehow, I mean, this political option that you said this kind of consensus that you defined before on sort of regime change as a horizon for US policy vis-a-vis China, is it something that is linked to the electoral campaign for the presidential elections? Or it's a strategic choice that actually makes sense according to your logic? Because, you know, somehow to me it seems that is depriving the US approach to China from a lot of flexibility.
Well, actually, the timing, there's no timing. This is like Ronald Reagan in 1981, right? He said, when he became president back in 1981, the State Department came to him and said, we have to work our way towards the September ministerials. That is a reference to when the foreign ministers go to New York, Gromyko will show up, then we can talk about the summit meeting that we will do the following spring. And Reagan said, don't worry, boys. You don't have to worry about the September ministerials. There's going to be no summit meeting. I don't want to meet those guys. I do not. And they said, what about coexistence, Mr. President? It's a basic axiom of US policy, coexistence. He said, well, I don't want to coexist with them. We want to exist. They must stop existing. That was his position. And there was no timeline, of course. And there's no timeline now. And definitely is nothing to do with the elections. Nancy Pelosi's position is not connected. Schumer is not connected, nor Trump. Trump had that position always, all along. Now, the only way that this thing could be sidetracked, delayed, even stopped for a while would be if China were to return to the peaceful rise policy. They'll go back to the actual peaceful rise policy enunciated on Hainan Island in 2004 by Jiang Bijian, my old friend. By the way, when I went to him years later and said to him, where happened to peaceful rise? He said to me, runaway horses, runaway horses. He didn't say, oh, you did this and we did that. No, runaway horses. So if they capture the horse and go back and they go around apologizing to Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, all these countries, then the next chapter will not happen. But if they don't revert to peaceful rise, the next chapter opens. And the next chapter is called Remind a Land Power that it is a land power by activating all these 27 land neighbors in some way or other. Because Xi Jinping, as you know, has shrunk the Chinese army to a very small army, million some, and has nothing all around China. The People's Armed Police is very big, but so what maritime powers do, like India, Japan, United States, Australia do when confronted by land power, is to remind the land power that it is a land power by visiting its neighbors. And some of the neighbors you visit, like India, by building infrastructure in the Himalayas, that's the Japanese are doing, the roads, the highways. Others you give weapons to, others you give training to, others you give support to, and so on and so forth. And you can already see that some of the countries around China have changed their attitude. The Mongols, for example, they've become belligerent against the Chinese. The Kazakhs never said a word about China. Now they have complaints every week. And they put very, very strict restrictions on what the Chinese embassy can do in Nur Sultan. And things of that sort. So the maritime powers are working all around China. And of course, the main country around China is Russia. And the Russian position on China is, of course, a transactional, Putin, Xi Jinping is honking kiss, but the Russian Navy University in Vladivostok published a study, big study, on Chinese frontier policy, in which they said that all Chinese claims not actively advanced are dormant, okay? They used dormant, they used the Russian verb, which is in Oblomov, you know, the famous novel about the guy who thinks about waking up and getting dressed and going to work, and the whole thing is so tiring, he goes back to sleep. Dormant. In other words, they want Vladivostok. So that is the next phase. The maritime powers surround China.
Edward, sorry. I understand that China can be a problem for. I mean, it's normal for a country like China to have territorial disputes, you know, with neighboring countries. Yeah. This is like classic. It doesn't necessarily pertain to Chinese history. It's just something that happens everywhere else in the world. But my question for you is, what if you have to identify the nature of China's threat to the US? It's ideological, it's military, it's economic.
No. It has to do that the Chinese concept is that it has to be a China-centered world. And for that purpose, China has to become more powerful. And for that purpose, the Chinese have to work very hard, but also China needs technology. And the technology,
who told?
You have to buy, borrow, or steal, and they've done every damn thing possible. They have anybody who works for General Electric, who is a China-born US citizen, or an American-born person of Chinese extraction, or anything of the sort, is approached by Chinese intelligence to sell them technology. Every one of them. Okay, the Chinese have numbers. So their intelligence operation is in terms of stealing technology, buying technology, acquiring technology. It's the first thing that bothers the Americans. And that has been the strongest reaction. That's where the steps have been taken. And now it's got to the stage where Huawei can be just shut out of business completely by simply preventing Taiwan Semiconductor from making integrated circuits. So technology is a direct clash. They want to be number one, and we want them to be number zero. And since we have technology and they don't, then so far, of course, we're going to win. Then there are confrontations ideological. For example, the Chinese go to Budapest and encourage the Hungarian neo-Horthian, neo-fascist, whatever, and they encourage him and support him. They go to Italy, where there is the Cinque Stelle and corruption, and they do corruption. In other words, the Chinese way of becoming number one is to undermine everybody else who might oppose them. And in Europe, I mean, if you go to European Commission building in Brussels In front of it, there is a most impressive embassy. It's a big, solid concrete building full of electronic equipment. And you know who it belongs to? Malta. Malta. Because if they're the ones who bought the building in front of the European Commission, that's why when three guys in the European Commission talk about something to do with China, the next day, Global Times is already writing that, you know, we can't stand these Slovaks because they want to do something rather, okay? So the Chinese are, and they believe themselves to be the future number one. And
so it's an hegemonic threat. That's what
completely hegemonic threat. And the Americans don't particularly care about being hegemonic because that's not how the American system works. But they certainly want to prevent the Chinese from being hegemonic.
Although the Americans are perceived as hegemonic by China, of course.
Yes, yeah, but they are only...
Not just by China.
Well, but except not quite, because the Chinese know they're dealing with Russia. They're dealing with numerous actors that are not, in fact, captive to American policy. So it is an unachieved hegemony and not one that the American people take seriously. No American president can get one vote by saying, I'm going to preserve American hegemony. What the Americans care about is winning wars. They've lost quite a few recently, and American public opinion is not particularly bothered by it. You know, it's not, the American political culture doesn't work in those ways. It has its own way of working.
If I can, Edward, let me take this opportunity to thank you. It's been a fascinating and spirited discussion. I feel like we could continue for another 2 or 3 hours, but we certainly don't want to impose on you. I want to thank you on behalf of Enrico and Ori for your time, and I hope we can do it again sometime in the near future.
Right.
Thank you,
Well,
Brendan.
meet you in person when I get to Tel Aviv as early as possible this summer.
We're
going to visit, I mean, flights are about to start anyway. I just have to first go to Asia. Well, no, is it Asia? I'm not even sure if it's Asia. I have to go to Polynesia because I'm overdue for my annual submersion snorkeling in Polynesia. After that, I'll go to Israel.
Thank you, Edward. We appreciate it.
Thank you.